Hi everyone, welcome back to another IBDP economics video. Today we'll be covering chapter 2.1 about demand. Now the first thing we need to remember is that the law of demand states that when the price of a good increases, the demand will decrease and vice versa. Now this is assuming that all things stay the same, which in economics we refer to it as ceteris paribus, meaning all things stay the same. So assuming that nothing about the good changes and only the price of it changes, the law of demand will apply. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, we have the income effect, which essentially states that when the price of a good or service decreases, you can afford to buy more of that. Now, let's take a good such as computers as an example, right? When the price of a computer goes down, you can afford to buy more computers, with assuming that your income stays exactly the same. So, if you could previously only afford to buy one computer with your income, and the price cuts in half, that means you can now buy two computers because your income remains exactly the same. Now, another reason for this is the substitution effect, which essentially means that when the price of a particular good or service decreases, or your particular good or service decreases, you draw demand away from substitutes. Now, let's use computers again, right? Let's say Windows computers and MacBooks, right? When the price of a MacBook decreases, you can draw customers away from Windows computers, and their demand therefore goes to you. So therefore your demand increases. Now, there's one more rule we have to think about, which is called the law of diminishing marginal utility, which essentially states that for each additional unit of a good or service that you consume, the utility you get decreases. Now, what does utility mean? First of all, utility essentially means the amount of satisfaction or usefulness of consuming one unit of a good or service, right? Now, we have a man eating a burger on the screen, right? We can take this as an example, right? If I'm really, really hungry, the utility I'll get from the first burger or the first unit of a burger that I consume will be really high because it will make me less hungry, right? And maybe for the second burger, it will be a little bit less. But as I continue to consume more and more burgers, right, the utility I get from it will decrease as I consume more and more because I'll get more and more full over time, right? So that's essentially the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now we have to discuss demand curves. How do we illustrate a demand curve, right? The first thing we need to do is we need to draw our axes, which we can label as price in dollars or whatever currency you're looking at, and quantity, right? We can just leave that quantity for now. So when we're drawing a demand curve, we need to start from the top over here and end at the bottom, right? So we start on the upper left and end on the bottom right, right? Obviously, the steepness of the curve will depend on what good you're looking at. But let's say this is the market for burgers. Now, let's say at the very top, your price is $10, right? We essentially just link it up to the demand curve, and you can find our quantity demanded here, which is going to be really low. So only, let's say, two people are going to be willing to buy our $10 burgers because $10 for a burger is really expensive, right? Now let's take a more reasonably priced burger, $5, right? Once again, we don't move the demand curve at all. We simply just link it. We just simply go along the curve. So $5 goes to here, this point, along the curve, and it goes to here, right? So let's say 10 people are willing to buy our burgers. So the quantity demanded for at $5 for a burger is 10 people or 10 units, right? Now let's say we've got a really, really nice but really, really cheap burger at just $2, okay? Now, using the law of demand, we can obviously predict that the quantity demanded for the burger will be very high because the price is so low, right? So a lot of people will be wanting our burgers, right? So our quantity will be up here, maybe, why do I keep drawing dollars? Maybe at 20, right? So that's essentially illustrating a demand curve. Let's go back to our presentation, right? Now, besides price, there's also something called non-price determinants of demand, right? So, what this means is that things besides price can affect the demand that we have for a certain good. So, let's take the first thing, a change in income, right? When your income increases, you'll be able to afford and you'll be more willing and able to buy more of a certain good at a higher price. So unlike a change in price, we would actually have to move the demand curve completely, right? So let's take the demand, we draw another demand curve, price, quantity, and of course, we have our demand curve itself. Now let's change it to red, not to, so we can make it less confusing, right? When your income goes up, right? Let's take a market for, let's say, phones, right? You'll be more willing to pay a higher price. Like at a higher price, you'll demand more of a certain good than before if the average income in a country increases. Now, how do we illustrate this, right? We would illustrate this as the demand curve going outwards to the right. So we would obviously have to demonstrate this with an arrow showing that it has shifted. So previously, at $10, or sorry, we're talking about phones now, at $1,000, demand is pretty low because $1,000 is a pretty expensive phone, right? But if we just get rid of the old one, right? Let's just mark it, right? Over here was the previous demand, right? Now, when we have our new product, our new income, right? Demand for it will be a lot higher at $1,000 because our income has increased. So we can link it up to the demand curve, to the new demand curve, and we can see that demand is now here, which is pretty high, right? It's high compared to what we had before, right? So that's an example of how the demand curve itself can shift because of a non-price determinant, right? And another thing we can talk about is the price of a substitute good, right? We did kind of cover this kind of earlier in the video, but let's redraw our demand curve, right? The price of a related or substitute good. Let's think of a related or substitute good in the market for phones, right? Let's say we're talking about iPhones in this case, okay? Now, if the price of an Android phone increases, right, the demand for an iPhone will increase because people are going to switch from Android to iPhone, right? So once again, shifts outwards, right? Very simple, okay? Now let's remove this market thing, all right? Let's just talk about a different market this time for our third non-price determinant. Future price expectations, right? Let's say it's for a house, okay? Previously, at 100,000, right? Our demand for a house is pretty low, right? Let's say only 5 units are demanded, right? But what future price expectations means is the price that you think it's going to be a couple months or a couple years or a couple decades in the future, right? So let's say the housing market is kind of low right now, but you predict that there's going to be economic boom, which means real estate prices would go up, right? So your future price expectation for that same house is going to be higher in the future, right? So let's illustrate a new demand curve, right? Let's say you're a home buyer and you think, or you're an investor and you think, I think the price of this exact house in 10 years time is going to be 300K, right? So the demand for buying this house now at $100,000 is going to be a lot higher than before, right? You're going to be demanding it a lot more. The quantity demanded is going to be a lot higher. It might be at 30, right? Because people think the price is going to go up. So they buy that house as an investment because they think that they can sell it for $200,000 of profit in the future. Now, 2 more to cover, okay? Another non-price determinant we can talk about is taste and preferences, right? I want you to think of something that's been popular recently, right? I mean, times will change, obviously, but let's think of a popular product, something that's been really popular on social media that a lot of influencers have been buying, right? So, when the tastes and preferences of a market improves, right? Let's say someone, like people begin to think that a product is really cool or really in, right? The demand curve will also shift outwards, right? This can be applied oppositely as well, right? Let's say a product becomes really stupid or people don't really like it, or let's say there's been negative media coverage, right? It would go inwards, right? To the left-hand side, right? But let's say, for the sake of this video, that a certain product has gotten really positive media coverage and people start to think that it's a really, really nice product and people think, it becomes more and more popular, right? Same thing as before. Demand increases at the same price. There is a change in demand, right? And now, finally, there's something called demographic changes, right? Let's imagine a boom in birth rates, right, in a certain country, right? The market, if there's a boom in birth rates and there's a lot more babies being born, the demand for baby products like diapers will increase a lot, right? Because a lot more babies are born and a lot more babies need diapers, so therefore a lot more diapers are demanded, right? So it's the same thing. It shifts, demand will increase, right? Because the physical demand curve will shift because this no longer has anything to do with price. It just has something to do with a change in the number of babies. Just like how if there's a decrease in number of babies, it'd be there. The demand curve would shift that way, right? Because there's less babies, so less diapers are needed. That's pretty much it for the non-price determinants of demand. Thank you.